Usually people clap. It is truly, am I gone? Okay, well, I'm low enough. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, An Attack Against One is an Attack Against All, from civil rights to Black Power, presented in conjunction with our acclaimed exhibition here at Poster House, Black Power to Black People, Branding the Black Panther Party. Oftentimes, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement are often presented as two discrete and at times antithetical campaigns. While these separate approaches relied on different tactics and strategies, they both were effective in securing fundamental human rights for Black people in America and have more in common than is usually generally recognized here. Both address their audiences through powerful visual imagery and accessible visible language, thereby galvanizing the masses. Tonight, curators and Poster House's own educator coordinator, Esperanza Humphrey, will be in conversation with Lance Wheeler and Nicole Moore of the National Center of Civil and Human Rights, and in moderation by Poster House's own advisory board member, Michelle Washington. Before we get started, I wanted to share just a few notes on accessibility here for this event. Of course, this program is being live streamed for our YouTube audience. Hi, YouTube. So for you all, automated closed captionings are available for you to be turned on or to be turned off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully I'm aiming at the bottom of your screen. Of course, this is our third hybrid event of the year, so we do apologize if any technical difficulties happen during our stream, and we appreciate your patience as we work through them. For our in-person audience, if you have any additional accessibility needs for the program, please feel free to see our lovely gallery assistants at the front of house, who will do their best to assist you. Just for general knowledge, so bathrooms are located directly across from the cafe from which you walked in, and we'll be having a Q&A session at the end, so we ask that you hold all of your questions until that time. YouTube audience, your questions will be answered as well, so put them in the chat, we will make sure that we get to them. And obviously, you've seen me stand up for like 5 minutes at this time. I'm going to hand it off to our lovely panel to get started for the evening. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Okay, so let's start with, this doesn't sound like it's on, but let's start with Lance and Nicole, who have a great presentation for you all, and then we're gonna hand it to Michelle, and then we're gonna open it up for Q&A after I do a couple of guided questions.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Moore. I'm the Director of Education at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. I'm a public historian by training, and at the center, I manage all K-12 initiatives. We are currently going through an expansion, not just physically with our building, but also with our educational programming. And so I am leading the charge to change how we are teaching civil and human rights historically and contemporarily, especially in a place like Georgia where a lot of our truth-telling in history is being under review. So I'm very excited to be here. I am a graduate of UNC Charlotte, both undergrad and grad. I have psychology and history degrees, and I think that's really helped me approach the work that we do, particularly at the center, when dealing with histories that don't make me uncomfortable, but might make other people uncomfortable, and trying to get them to grapple with those feelings and then also sit with it, but do something positive for their communities afterwards. I'll hand it over to Lance.
Good evening.
Yeah, it came off.
Lance Wheeler, I'm the Director of Exhibitions at the Center. My job there is to help maintain the physical exhibitions, incoming exhibitions, outgoing exhibitions, anything exhibition related as well. But I'm also a public historian. I consider myself a museum practitioner as well, where Nicole and I are also leading our institution in the content development of our expansion. So that can be text, that's also physical new exhibitions that are going to be in the space, but also making sure that we are having the necessary conversations in our spaces today, right? We want to also move past the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but what is happening currently in the American landscape? And so that is our job every day. But also I'm a believer that museums are a place that holds artifacts, but our real job is to get people to have the deeper conversations. History should be conversational, not just facts. about dead people and numbers. And so Nicole and I try to make history, the content that we have in our space, a conversation each and every day.
And we are going to, before I dive really deep into who we are and what our mission is, we'll show you a little bit about the work that we're doing to transform ourselves. Is there no audio?
We have to go to the
Somewhere
root.
I read that the greatness of America is
200,000
There will be
people converge on the
moments
nation's
of this cycle happening over.
To create change in their communities. And so we're doing this by expanding not just our building and our physical walls, but we're expanding our programming. We are in the DEI landscape in Atlanta. We are doing some work with law enforcement. We're expanding our educational programs so that we can help people understand what it means to tell the truth of history. With our exhibits, we are expanding our narratives to take it beyond just that master narrative of the civil rights movement, where everybody thinks everything ended in 1968, and getting people to understand that there was so much more that happened and that is still happening. And with our expansion, we're able to expand those narratives through the content that we tell. Right now, we don't talk about the Black Panther movement, and that Black Party movement, or Black Power movement. We don't talk about the Black Panthers. We have a quote here and there, and visitors have asked us for years, where is that content? Our 9th birthday is tomorrow. And so with our expansion, when we open and we finish our 2 additional wings, we'll be able to tell them that the civil rights movement that you know of and the Black Power movement that you think you know of were happening concurrently, that they weren't separate movements. And getting people to think about what it means to have a movement evolve, that's so important to us. To get them to understand what it means to bear witness, to understand that racial terror and lynching didn't happen just in the Gilded Age. It still happens. We need to talk about that. Because until we start having these conversations and creating those deeper engagements that get people to think, we can't elicit change. And so when we think about our mission as being that place that convenes, that brings people together, that builds those conversations, that's where we're going. We're starting, we've been there, but that's what we're going to expand the narrative, because we realize now more than ever, we need to be talking to each other. We need to be comfortable in the discomfort that comes with conversations we've ignored for pretty much centuries at this point. So how do we talk about what civil rights means? How do we embrace fully what it means to ensure and protect the human rights of every person? I always tell people, yo, be selfish. And they look at me funny when I say that. But I say, if you're selfish about what matters to you, take that same energy and use that to protect the rights of somebody else. Because you would want that for you. And so if we can have these conversations in our spaces, and if we can break out of just a simple narrative that ends in 1968 and starts in 1954, I think we'll really be able to engage people in understanding that movements don't stop, they evolve.
Yep.
I'm gonna stop talking.
That was pretty good.
Thank you.
Was good. That was good.
Do you want to do this one? All right, so
You on a roll.
I'm on a roll. Let's get it. So right now what we do is when we're looking at civil rights as a narrative, for us, it was getting people to understand, oh, I'm sorry, y'all. My bad. For us, it was getting the public to understand that the issues that were happening to African Americans in this country wasn't new to us, but the media helped put it on blast. And so a lot of our footage, a lot of the images that you see in the museum, they're archival footage. It's those primary sources of photos, videos, oral histories, so that people can get that. We have films that, that we've produced that look at events like Brown versus Board. People just think, oh, it desegregated schools, yay. They don't realize that schools were still suffering through desegregation in the 2000s. And so they understand that, well, where's the genesis of this? And it was looking at the doll experiment with Mamie and Kenneth Clark. It was thinking about how Dr. King was, at the time he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest African American to win the prize. But in Atlanta, they were not for it. The segregationists were leaning in real hard to we don't care. And it wasn't until Robert Woodruff threatened to pull Coke out of Atlanta. Imagine Coca-Cola not being in Atlanta. That changes a lot of our landscape, that people actually attended the dinner. They attended, they didn't want to be there, but they came. And so we highlight those stories. We look at the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. And when we have young people come through the building, oftentimes they think Dr. King, they think Rosa Parks, they think John Lewis as the adult. But they're not thinking about what my peers were doing. So when they see images of Ruby Bridges, they're like, wait a minute, she looked like me. That's my age. When they see the Freedom Riders, they realize these were kids who were risking it all. When they see the Children's Crusade, they realize, wait a minute, these babies cut school to fight for rights? Those are kids my age. When they can see that through that archival footage, we're not telling them, we're not trying to impress anything on them. They're picking that up from the primary sources that are presented. And so that's one of the ways that we get people to really kind of look at the civil rights narrative, which is through that media footage. Because before we had that, a lot of these stories were encapsulated in our communities and we knew about it, but on a national scale, you could easily ignore it. But once it hit the media, you can't ignore it. And we use that to help people understand the importance of also media literacy, knowing what it means to understand your sources and understand the angles of your sources. We also have our award-winning lunch counter exhibit. So if anybody's ever been to the center in Atlanta, number one thing they'll say is you gotta do the lunch counter. And the lunch counter is a real experience for people who can't necessarily fathom what it would have been like. So they put on headphones, they sit at a lunch counter, they listen to the audio, and there are some physical things that happen. And a lot of times people that get off the counter and they're like, who was touching me? Nobody was touching you, baby, nobody was touching you. But the way that the audio is set up, it's binaural audio, it feels like somebody is breathing on you. You hear it, you feel it. And for people who are trying to understand what it would have been like, who are grappling not necessarily with the empathy, but they're really like, I don't understand what was that? When they sit at that lunch counter and they hear the audio and they feel what happens, I always ask them when they get off, do you think you could do it? And a lot of times people are ashamed when they say no. And I'm like, don't be, because there's a role for you elsewhere. The other thing that we do really well is we get people to understand that there are multiple roles. When we think about what it means to lead a movement, to be a part of a movement, people think they have to be on the front lines, and they don't. Somebody had to make the sandwiches. Somebody had to make the signs. Somebody had to make the posters. When people realize that they can utilize their skills in a way that is helpful, that may mean somebody never knows their name or that they were a part of it, but they know that they were there. There's a power in telling that narrative in that way. But again, like I said before, people have asked us, but what about Black Power? What are y'all doing about that? Because right now,
This is what we have.
this is what we have. This is our imagery of Black Power. It's the Black Power fist. We have quotes that are attributed to Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and Dr. King. That's it. But what's exciting with our expansion is that we are going to build on that story, and we're going to give people what they need to know, what they deserve to know, what they've been asking for 9 years. So I'm going to let Lance tell y'all a little bit about what we're doing with Black Power.
So before you move this slide, as you can tell, that is a door frame. That's a frame of the door. That's all we have. And so, like Nicole was just saying, it is a constant conversation. Why was it left out? What does that mean? Is the center making a stance against Black Power? Right? Those are the conversations that we're having daily. And so we move on to the next slide. For our expansion, that space is going to be completely redone. Right? We're going to talk about Black Power, Black activism. What is the terminology Black Power, Black business? We're going to include more than just quotes. We're going to include imagery. We're going to also include some of deeper dives into those. What is nationalism? What does that mean? We are also working with some consultants, right? Former members of SNCC, and I'm also going to say still members of SNCC to them. So, for example, Ms. Karen Spellman, SNCC, maybe Charlie Cobb, SNCC, right? Understanding that yes, we can come from it as a historical perspective, but we want to work with people that are actually who lived and breathed this work. And so we are still having this conversation on what we should include, what is the imagery, what is the takeaway from this. And so that's what we've been doing the last almost 2 years.
Yeah.
And so, but also like this conversation, right? How the nonviolent protests, right? Because when we think Black Power, we're thinking of a militant group as well. But how does those stories come together? In my opinion, the time that Black people arrived here as enslaved people, Black Power has already started. We are resisting a system of oppression the moment we arrive here. You see that once again in slavery, you see that in Reconstruction, you see that in the Civil Rights Movement, and also against Jim Crow and Black codes. This Black Power is still happening today. So we wanted to make sure we are carrying that forth, not just in this gallery, but also the other galleries that are coming online. Nicole also referred to a Bearing Witness. That is also a gallery that we're bringing online, looking at lynchings, right? But also there is a resistance to that as well. So, and we are done. So we're gonna pass it on to our colleague.
Yes.
Oh, you got a mic.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Washington, and I'm a designer, researcher, writer, critic, and educator at times. I am going to talk about messages to the people, which I actually referenced from an exhibition at the Smart Museum that took place about several years ago that was based on AfriCobra. And it intertwined the AfriCobra movement of the 60s, 70s, that also meshes together civil rights and Black Power. So I just felt that the title was very befitting for the exhibition here, being that they're talking about branding the Black Power movement, is that these were messages that were applicable to the people. This image here is by Purple Jones, who was a photographer for the Panther Party. And it's also sort of referenced in a film in which these women are chanting, "Black is beautiful." Okay. So I wanted to start with the American Black Holocaust Museum. Excuse me. And it sort of fits in with the same framework in which Nicole and Lance were talking about, where you mesh together the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. But the interesting thing about this museum is that it's located in Milwaukee, and it's a very small museum, and it goes all the way back to slavery, through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and it's all the way up to what's happening now with Black Lives Matter. And there is a lot of content in the museum, and Dr. James Cameron is the founder of the museum. And if you ask us a question, we'll explain to you why he actually set up this museum. So I'm not going to give away all the gems right now. But the interesting thing is also, if you think about the Green Book, which defined how Black people could travel in the United States, where they could stay, safe passage, and the fact that a man is lynched by police every day, which actually signifies like the killing of Black bodies, whether it's men or whether it's women, and how you have Black Lives Matter movement, and that interlaces with civil rights, but it gives it more of a contemporary context and a critique. But instead of having signs, you now have the signs that's on your body in your t-shirts. Okay. So, in thinking about how language and ephemera gets used, this is a variation of signs and slogans like Freedom Now, SNCC, One Man, One Vote, which was really for voting rights, and where you commonly see like Malcolm X, and you see Martin Luther King, but you also see I Am a Man, which is reference from Ralph Ellison's book, and talks to like how not to be seen as invisible, and the fact that you do not want to be called a boy. And this is from the Memphis trash strike. This was from an exhibition that was at the DeSable Museum that covered like Black power and civil rights. And also if you think about SNCC, which was really big, which pushing forth the right to vote. So there's a lot of things that happen in the 60s and 70s, and even happens now, that are around humanity, equity, and empowerment of people. So, moving forward, and thinking about how designers and artists are tackling some of these issues, I'll start with the top one. The top row, the one that's black and white, and the one that's next to it, and that following one. Those are all by Archie Boston, who was a designer. And Archie worked mainly in advertising. And these are concepts that he has come up with. The two in the middle are current concepts. And the one on the far right also references the one with their American flag that looks like blood dripping, with similar slogans and terms of what Black people have been called over time. Some were complimentary, some not so complimentary. The one at the bottom, that's by Maurice Woods, and the top one on the right, that's Archie Boston, as I mentioned. And those were done for two different exhibitions. Archie Boston was done for visual perceptions, and the one at the bottom by Maurice Woods was done for an exhibition in San Francisco that was curated by Steve Jones. The two at the bottom on the far right, those are by Ed Towles. I wanted to include them both in because one has to do with Harriet Tubman bringing slaves forward from the south up to the north and along the Underground Railroad and a freedom path, but also looking at what Ed Towles, who is a designer and a visual artist, how he looked at it globally and looked at liberation and Black and African liberation that worked in sync with what was happening here in America. And the two that are always on the left, the bottom one is by Bobby Martin, and he did a range of posters that he posted on Instagram, like right after George Floyd was killed. And this is like really about life and death, that life and death really matter. and it's beyond Black Lives Matter. And the top one is an interactive poster that was from the Millen's Report, and it's designed by Ann Barry. And the two give you different ways of looking at Black matter. One more typographic, the other one is typographic and visual. And then the one that, of the young lady talking on the phone, If Black Lives Matter, it really gives you a sense of the importance of her in this conversation that she's having. Okay. And looking at other spaces of how artists actually tackle messaging. I always feel that sometimes artists are the ones that get to these situations and problems first before designers do. And I know there are a few designers in the audience who might disagree with me, they're out there. But, and there are a lot of designers that studied fine art, so that also gives them a leg up. But this is the wall of respect that was created in 1967 in Chicago, in the Brownsville section of Chicago, predominantly Black community. And it was created by AfriCobra, and there was also another group that formed before our AfriCobra called the Organization of Black American Culture. And what they did was they painted this mural on the side of a building in Brownsville, like I think it's 47th and Longdale. And it's really a compilation of historical figures, legendary figures, luminary jazz figures, and musicians and performers. And so with the Organization of Black American Culture, they had a visual arts section. And so they were a group of visual artists that band together, and they were charged with painting each of the sections. And so there was a sketch that was originally designed for this by Sylvia Leonie Abernathy. But Jeff Donaldson is the one who actually oversaw this and implemented this. So, and moving forward. So these are other imagery from AfriCobra that are from this exhibition at the Smart Museum. And I think I might have thrown a couple in from Souls of the Nation that was at the Brooklyn Museum. But they give you a sense of the role of women, the role of language and vernacular, and color, and also power. And AfriCobra, even though I often think of it coming out of Chicago, I've met people that were not from Chicago here in New York City that were also part of AfriCobra, that were like musicians and writers and photographers and artists too. So they're the gun-toting women, and then in the middle there is the figure that has graphics and typography that's intertwined in their hair, and it's a big puffy afro. And the whole thing about the symbolism of the afro is that in many ways you had the TWA, which was the teeny weeny afro, and then you had the big puffy afro. And that big puffy afro in some ways defined, like in the 60s and 70s, like if you were really powerful and militant. And then we get the united, the way that type is deconstructed with the raised militant fists talking about Black power. The one poster that's really interesting is embedded with like how bullets were carried by Black militant figures, and then dress. So there was clothes that also was a part of this exhibition. And one of the things that I think is really interesting when you think about the Panthers and you think about people always like to make a difference between civil rights and the Panthers, you start to think that one was just more militant and divisive, but as Lance said, it all started and interweaved together. But with the Panthers being in San San Francisco, Reagan was the governor. So at the time of Reagan being the governor, you could actually carry guns for self-defense. But Reagan changed the laws.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yes.
He always
Immediately.
does.
So he changed the laws so that the Black Panthers could not carry those guns. But with AfriCovert, there was a style that they had in how they used color, really bright, very vibrant colors, and how they used figuratives of people and words, and there was this intertwining of words and phrases and slogans throughout. These are clothes that were part of the exhibition in the middle, and on the right, black and white, where typists are printed on, like a jacket that somewhat looks like a Nehru jacket, and in the middle, it's almost like a crown and a series of belts that fade off of each other. And then I could not resist throwing in Elizabeth Catlett, who did these prints of Bobby Seale and Huey and a gun, and the reference to the symbolic Black Power fist. I would be a myth if I did not talk about the women that were part of the Black Panther Party. And so in Oakland, I'm gonna say West Oakland, there is the Women's Black Panther Party Museum that is in a Victorian house. And on the side of the house, there is a mural that's on the side, and it wraps around to the back of the house. And the mural is by a group called like the Wolf Pack, but it's part of a crew with Rachel Wolf. And the figures here of these women is based on a photo taken by Stephen Shane. And then there was a sketch that was done by one of the other people on our teams. I think it was named James Shepard. And then there's the Starburst in the back, which is they contribute their ode to Emory Douglas. So the owner of the house, Jill Christian, she's also like the curator. And she was able to have a conversation with Elizabeth Tuffle, who also provided a lot of the materials for Angela Davis' exhibition. So Elizabeth gave her a lot of the materials that you will see inside of the house. And everything is really on the first floor, but just being outside the house is an experience into itself. So this takes you around the back. So there's a lot of type. And in one of the areas, they have a section which has just about as many names as they could collect from around the country of women that were part of the Black Panther Party. Much like the Black Church, Black Baptist Church, where there are women, and there were a lot of women involved in the Civil Rights Movement and in SNCC. So you would not have a lot of these movements.
You can't have it without women.
Without women.
Especially Black women.
Yes. And, you know, the interesting thing, like when you go inside and you look at a lot of the materials that are in here, you'll see a lot that really pertains to the programs that were instrumental, from a food program, health program, education, program for seniors. So the Panthers had a free food program where they fed kids in the morning. So if you think about the program that you have now that are free food programs for kids in public school systems, that really came out of the Black Panthers. And so they did a lot that was really community-based. So it's all about humanity and caring for the community. And I would be really a myth if I did not talk about music.
Yes.
Music was a big part, whether you look at it from the Civil Rights Movement or you think about the 60s and 70s and Black Power movement. music was really instrumental. So if you look at the last poets, you look at Gil Scott-Heron, you look at Gil Scott-Heron, Brian Jackson, you look at James Brown, who we cannot forget, Curtis Mayfield. You think about We Shall Overcome, which was a song that you would always hear sang like in churches, on the streets, while people were marching, and Sweet Honey in the Rock were very instrumental in being part of the civil rights movement. Marvin Gaye. And what's interesting is that Berry Gordy really fought hard to not get Marvin Gaye, to not allow Marvin Gaye to actually sing or record music that he viewed that was political, but that music became very popular and I'm sure it made Motown a lot of money. Yep. The Staples sisters, Papa Staples, Mavis Staples, yep. Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, Mahalia Jackson, Isaac Hayes, and Shaft. And Shaft is really interested in Isaac Hayes because even though you might think of that as the time period of black exploitation, what was critical about that time is that that changed the trajectory of films because Isaac Hayes had a sound score, and that sound score became a record. And so it changed the movie industry into thinking how they could like make sound scores. And now you could have a record and you could make money. So that really was pivotal. So as I start to wind up, Emory Douglas still works and produces work. And these are 3 posters that I bought during my visit in April that Emory produced. So one is like a mother and daughter in the middle, the other one deals with the environment, and the other poster is like of a young kid talking about, speaking of balance and Black Lives Matter. And his style may have changed somewhat because there's more color in the work than if you look at some of the other posters. And if you know anything about design, you can think about, you would know that it's very costly to print color. So I'm gonna rock this out, hopefully with a little music from Brother Gil.
You will not be able to plug in and turn on and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on a stand and sit back from here during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox and Small Pop without commercial instructions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, Little Neighbors, and Spiral Avenue, City Hall was confiscated from the Harlem Sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Chamber of War Theater and will not star Natalie Wood and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Jr.
So that's it.
Oh, no. We were just getting into it.
Thank you.
Obrigada. Thank you all so much. Let's give another round of applause for our panelists. I really appreciate, Nicole and Lance, how you mentioned like media literacy, and I think that it's so important, especially at a place like Poster House, because we have the exhibition, Black Power to Black People, and posters are media. Like that's a way to consume a message. And at Poster House we have, I'm very liberal about the definition of posters here, but we have a very strong, passionate feeling toward posters and how they serve certain purposes and what they're meant to do for the public. And I think that by even displaying it, even having a place like Poster House, we're able to teach media literacy. And I think that's so important when we think about the civil rights movement, because the everyday person, how are they interacting with the things that they were seeing? How are they interacting with a newspaper? SNCC had a newspaper. How are they interacting with that? Posters were created. How are they interacting with that? And then, Michelle, you and I have had this conversation, but the mention of women's roles, ooh,
This microphone does not like us.
The mention of women's roles is so important, and I think that with this conversation, we can think about, I remember reading that Diane Nash had the letters from all freedom rides that they trusted her to hold because she was really central in being the communication for these freedom riders. And so they wrote letters to their families just in case they didn't make it. And if they did, you know, that's great, but they trusted her so much. So the role of women is so important. I'm really happy that you mentioned that, Michelle. Also the music, I thought we were gonna jam for a little bit longer, so I was getting into it, but I think you stopped at a perfect time because then we wouldn't have time for questions.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of everything that we have just seen and kind of the natural conversation that I can feel was coming out of the topics that were on display for everybody, I wanna ask specifically, Lance and Nicole, if you wanna jump into this as well. In terms of recruitment, in what ways do we see civil rights activists galvanizing the public through images? Because in Black Power to Black people, they're galvanizing the public through images. But the images are different. They're a lot more, and we're gonna get into militancy, so we're gonna dive into that. But we see the way they're galvanizing the public in the images downstairs, but what are specific ways that we see civil rights activists doing that?
So I would say through many forms, right? You have posters, you have pins, you have buttons, you have flyers, right? It is, so imagine you're wearing a 1914 NAACP pin, right? That is a form of resistance, that is recruitment, right? But then also you're having mass meeting protest signs, right? Come to this church at this time, come worship, let's organize, let's mobilize, let's think about what we're going to do. But then also, you think about imagery, right? I think the most well-known and most common one is the image of Emmett Till, right? That image alone, even how gruesome it is and horrific, how do you do this to a child? It showed that Jim Crow had no bounds, right? But that image alone recruited a generation which they call themselves the Till generation. So you're thinking about like Charlie Cobb of SNCC, you're thinking about Dorian Joyce Ladner of SNCC and COFO. You're thinking about Medgar Evers, the first field secretary for the NAACP. That is his very first case. So that imagery alone changed the American landscape, right? And if we look at also the Children's Crusade, right? May 2nd and May 3rd, 1963. That turned 60 this year, y'all, right? So that image of that young man being attacked by a dog, being shot with hoses, right? Black elegance, right? Versus white supremacy, right? That is the imagery that we're seeing, and those are the images that are used to also recruit other people into the civil rights movement. But also, it is showing how, once again, I am trying to humanize myself. I am a human, I'm a first-class citizen, but I am being assaulted and attacked for my basic civil and human rights. So those are some of those imageries that you would see in the civil rights movement that helps recruit, but also helps starts the process of changing the American mindset, specifically the white American mindset.
Yeah, he handled that.
I mean, we also see that the image of the Scottsboro Boys is an international thing. Like, once internationally people become aware of it, they start to even publicize on their broadcasts, like, this is actually happening to Black people in America. And I mean, I can go on a diatribe about like, okay, come on, you should know that this is happening in America. But that is a really powerful image to see these boys in prison garb or in jail garb because of something that they're being accused that they had done that they were innocent for.
And also imagine we're having a world war happen, right? We're fighting for equality and nationally, internationally for everybody, but then you come back to America and then you're treated like second-class citizens, right? And so you have these individuals such as Medgar Evers, such as other World War II veterans saying, I fought for this country, right? I defended the democracy of this country, but now I'm being treated like second-class citizens. And so the imagery with that also helps move and push and get people involved in the movement.
So two things you should think about. You have the black press,
Yes.
newspapers.
Yep.
You have magazines.
Yep.
And then they covered
Yep.
all of this way before the white press ever covered it. But when you have the white press move in, you have television
Yes.
that comes in and really makes everything not just national but global, like you said. So there's this transition that happens
Yep.
over time that really pushes everything out.
Definitely, thank you. And actually, Michelle, this is a great cue for you. This is technically for everybody, but I think that in terms of design, the inspiration for this event, everyone, was that I often get questions about the exhibition that feel like the civil rights movement is being pit against the Black Power movement, and the Black Power movement is the cooler and more hip movement, and they're borrowing cues from the counterculture movement that's already happening, and they're listening to funk, and they're listening to they have the leather jackets on, so it's seen as like that cooler movement. And then you top it off with, oh, they're militant, and they're resisting in ways that we don't see the civil rights movement resisting. And so I think an event like this is so important because we realize that that's so not true at all. So Michelle, how would you identify and define militancy, and how is it prevalent in design? And then Lance and Nicole, if you want to jump in as well.
That's a hard question. Excuse me. That's a hard question because I see both sides doing protests and protesting in different ways. So sitting at a lunch counter is a form of protest, and sitting at the lunch counters were not always met with nice favoritism. Dogs being released on young kids, and the bombing of 3 girls. So I think when you think about militancy, yes, I would say they were militant, and they may have been more strident, and they adopted a code of dress. But I also think civil rights workers had a code of dress. Too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the college students, the high school students, parents, and older people, they had a code of dress. So it overlapped. I don't think it was as inflammatory as we often think it to be. Because not everybody could sport a black leather jacket. No.
Right.
Yeah, you weren't going to do that all the time. But
Okay, so for me, I think if we're looking at both movements, I think we're going to use the term militant. I think the civil rights movement is also militant. Civil disobedience is going against Jim Crow, right? They made a conscious decision to say no more, right? That is the same thing that's happening in the Black Power movement. They're saying no more, and the movement is evolving, right? I also think the word militant is also weaponized on Black people when they decide to say no more. And so I think that's important to recognize. And you use that terminology to create fractions within Black organizations and movements. Because once now you have wild young people, women and men, picking up guns, they're militant. So we should probably go over there on the non-violent protests, right? And so now you're pitting two movements against each other. And so for me, I think just waking up every day under Jim Crow and living, that is militant, right? I think then making a conscious decision to use your body is militant, if we're gonna use it that way. And so there's no difference between these two movements. It's just a different approach, but they have the same common goal, so.
And I would say this question was one that I had to grapple with. And I looked up militancy and I was kind of hot. I was like, oh, looky here, me fitting the definition. Because it was about violence and aggression. And when we think about Black Power, what the misconception is when we think about the Black Panther Party, all people think is angry, violent, aggressive. But these folks were tired. They were tired of being treated like trash. They were tired of being treated like less than. And the way that we talk about it is always in a negative connotation. And instead, we don't really think about what would lead somebody to be so fed up that when we think about, like Lance was saying, how the large we, how they try to pit civil rights movement, Dr. King and them, versus Black Power. And when they're saying Black Power, they're really saying the Black Panther Party, and they're thinking of Huey and that image of the gun. These were two groups of people who were dealing with the same things, with the same audiences. But when we think about civil rights movement in that vein, the people were thinking of, well, nonviolence. They were nonviolent. But violence was still being enacted on them. And that was the whole point. They're like, we're gonna dress up, we're gonna look good, we're gonna look fresh, literally to death. But we're gonna do that because people are going to see the atrocities and this violence that's being enacted on us. Whereas I look at Black Power, it becomes, y'all gonna beat me up, I'm gonna be comfortable in it. I'm gonna look good, but I'm going to show power as well. And we mistake that just because they might have had their clothing with bullets on it, or because they had their weapon, they were like, we're defending ourselves. Where's the militancy in saying, I'm not trying to die for foolishness. I'm gonna protect myself. I think when we think about militancy in both moments in a larger movement, we need to think about where people were like, okay, if this method is not working, then what else do I need to do? And I think we need to understand that militancy in that vein then doesn't become something that should be viewed as a negative or violence, but instead it becomes, how do I protect myself? How do I protect my community? How do I get you to understand, I tried it this way, I'm gonna try it this way, we're gonna see what happens. And it's the resistance. It doesn't have to be this, y'all are angry all the time. We have a right. But how do we get people to understand that militancy means to stand up? And if at that point we fight back different, then we fight back different. But it shouldn't be because we're angry and we're aggressive. At some point, we're trying to live. And can militancy be seen in the same way as survival?
I think it's important just like to set the stage, right? So in 63, which a lot of things turn 60 this year, so much is happening, right? And I have a running list, right? You have April 16th, the Birmingham letter. April 20th, William Moore is murdered. He's a white man. Provide context. May 2nd and 3rd, Birmingham Children's Crusade. May 28th, the Jackson Woolworth. They sat at that lounge counter for 3 hours and was assaulted. FBI was in there and they just watched, right? They only stopped because the store manager decided to close the store, right? Then you have the beating of Fannie Hamer at Winona Jail, June 9th. You have June 11th, President F. Kennedy gets his civil rights speech. June 12th, Medgar Evers is assassinated in his driveway with his wife and children in the home. Then you have the March on Washington, of course. And then you have the assassination of President Kennedy.
And the bombing in Birmingham.
And the bombing of Birmingham. So much is happening. So the first time that you're gonna start hearing the phrase Black Power is in Mississippi, right? All this is leading up to I wouldn't say a new movement, but a new way to attack this system of white supremacy and violence. So I just wanted to set the stage for you all really quickly, so.
Historians gonna history.
Sorry.
Also, you can go back a little further
Let's go back further.
with Ralph Ellison's book, the title is Black Power.
Yes.
And it really is based on, comes out of Ghana, I want to say, with an organization or conference or whatever. But the term did not just start like with the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times is to look at like what is the etymology of a word, where did this word and the origins come from, and also thinking about what Nicole and Lance talk about is that you can look at the cultural geographies between the North, the South, the East, and the West. Yes. You can think about time periods in which we all grow up, where some things were more active and prevalent during that time period, where you could talk about the experiences that you have. And you could also think about what they're talking about and how, in the work that they do, I would view them as Black memory workers. You want to talk about James Cameron?
Yeah, I can talk about James
Yeah.
Cameron. So,
I'm gonna let him talk about James Cameron because it's a really interesting story.
So James Cameron, who created the Black Holocaust Museum, is considered to be the only individual to ever survive a lynching, right? He is basically grabbed with two men, teenagers, let me rephrase that, not men, teenagers, Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith, and they were accused of raping a white woman. And so these three young men are going to be pulled out of jail, of course taken to the woods, and Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith are lynched. They're going to lynch Dr. Cameron, but a white woman in the crowd recognized him and said, "It's no way that he didn't do it. He did not do it." So they tied him to a tree. They made him watch those two young men be killed. And then they also collected souvenirs from the bodies. So the center owns the Without Sanctuary collection, which is a collection looking at lynchings on postcards and other objects from racial terror. And so in our collection, we have that picture with a lock of hair from one of those individuals. And so when we mentioned—
That's who the hair is from?
Yeah, one of those individuals, yes.
Oh my God. And this did not happen in the South?
Yes, this happened in Arkansas. Wait.
Indiana,
excuse me.
Indiana.
Yes.
Near Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to share that story because we
were
talking about and how history connects, right? And we owning that collection, we are opening up we are bringing on a new gallery called Bearing Witness is what we're calling it right now, where we're going to have those conversations about racial terror. Nicole and I made the decision that we do not want that object on display because we don't believe in black trauma porn, right? We believe on having the conversations, but we are not here to take humanity away from these individuals, even though humanity was stripped from them. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, that's it there.
Thank you all for that response. I always think about Angela Davis when she's getting interviewed with the orange turtleneck. She says, "You want to talk to me about violence?" Violence is the fact that the Birmingham church was bombed. That's violence. I see the question. That's what violence is. I also think about the long civil rights movement where it starts truly even before Emmett Till with Betty Owens, and she's R-worded, and she is brutalized, and she has to stand trial, and she has to perform femininity because the jury will not believe what she has to say. So that's violence. That's what I think is more important than even thinking about militancy. It's what would even be the cause? Why would we even need that? It's because these are the people who are spearheading violence. Okay, let's go to a Q&A. Are there any questions in the audience for any of the panelists?
That you're dealt with. And so I think for, my question to you guys is how do you instill militancy in young people, especially in an environment where you're really asked to assimilate, there's so much respectability politics, you're taught to work within the system, and so how do you continue to educate young people about the importance of militancy?
I think one of the ways that we do it, and we're starting to do it better, still growing, but it is ensuring that young people realize that they do have power and that they should not be afraid to activate that power, that they shouldn't be afraid to be advocates. One of our goals is to have an advocacy academy where we're helping young people, we're helping anybody realize what their power is and how they can use that to create positive change. The thing about young people activating their power today that concerns me is that we use the images and the examples of the 50s and the 60s. There was no social media. A lot of our activists were arrested, they have records. They were able to live full lives and keep working. But when we think about what it means to have a record today, how does that stop somebody from getting a job, finding a home, being able to continue to be a full citizen? And it's different today. But we still need young people to be able to tap into that power, and they need to know that their voices are what's going to cause change. But there are real realities that we have to grapple with. So we start asking the questions, or at least I start asking the questions, what are you willing to give up? And are you willing to risk it all? Because in the age that we live in, for some of them to take a stand today means that they give up their livelihood moving forward. But if a cause is just, and if a cause is right, and if it's what they believe in, then they're going to do what they need to do. But it is us understanding that while we want to use those examples of the past, the situations and the circumstances are completely different. John Lewis was locked up, skull cracked open to the white meat, and was in Congress. He had a record. An extensive record. But that may not be the same for the baby John Lewis today. And I think in making sure that we, as responsible stewards of the history and responsible stewards of how we want to help people move forward, is making sure that they know and that they are well aware of the risks that they're taking, but that also that there are organizations that are standing in the gap to support them because the times are different, and the support that they needed in the 50s and the 60s is definitely going to be a lot different from the support that they'll need 2023 and moving forward. But it's imperative that young people know that they have power and that we support them in using that power to change things. But in doing that, we also need to be responsible to them and ensuring that they have a path forward, just in case things do not turn out the way we would like them to.
And I would just add to that is, at least I know for me personally, it's having young people understand that you have a choice. You know, my generation, I'm a millennial, but my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation is you young people are going to change the world, right? That is also daunting. Why do I have to come in and change everything, right? And so I think also the center creates a space, and I think we create a space where we tell young people you have a choice. You can choose to do this and we will support you. And if you choose not to, we will still support you. And so I think that's also important to realize as well when pouring into our visitors as well.
Any other questions?
We give lengthy answers, we saw.
Any other questions?
This is a design question, so it's not as severe, but the co-optation of aesthetics and like the sterilization of like empowered aesthetics, how do you sort of work through that?
I'm gonna let you go.
Here you go.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Yeah, I think because there's so much stuff put out in the domain now, more so than it was before, because you have social media and you have the web, that people are can easily co-opt and take stuff, and you could transform stuff into something that it really is not. So I don't know that you would ever really be able to control it now. I think the way that you might have an issue is if you try and sell it. And that's where you could have a problem. And I think that will probably come up with the whole thing around AI, where they're taking bits and pieces of what artists and designers have done, and the artists and the designers are not being paid for any of that work. So you can think about all the protest signs, the posters, and all of that were done. We don't know whether any of the people were ever paid, but they still did the work because they were young, and like they said, like, you want to be a part of this, and this is how you engage. I mean, Emory Douglas did get paid for, you know, that work, and there were women that also worked with him that were designers on the newspapers, the flyers, and the print materials. But once it's out, I mean, you know, it's lost. But I think the people that are doing protest signage now, that put it up on social media, some of them are producing like other ephemera and materials that they may get paid for. Like with Emory Douglas, like those 3 posters that I showed you, like you can go to the gallery. He sells stuff at 2 different galleries in Oakland, and they're like t-shirts and different things that you could buy. At the Women's Black Panther Museum, she has like t-shirts and different pins and things that you could buy to help support the museum. And I think I was saying to Lance or Nicole earlier, there's a bag up front that talks about the food. Well, they have those food bags that are at the Black Panther Women's Museum, and I was interested in the bags, but they don't sell those bags there. That was all designed by Emory. So a lot of the materials that was produced by the Black Panthers wasn't sold, like the newspapers were sold. But to my understanding, I don't think all those posters were sold. But there will be somebody coming that's an expert on Emory. So
Yeah.
she can give you all that information, collect. Yeah.
I also heard you mention co-opting, the word co-opting, and just from a curatorial standpoint, I remember being very clear about, we were tossing around this idea of having a peacock chair in the exhibit, and it comes from Huey and the Peacock Chair. And someone had mentioned, I believe it was our chief curator, that another institution had had a peacock chair, and the optics of white people sitting in it and putting the raised fist up is something that we didn't even want to go there. So the peacock chair was scrapped. I think it took like 5 minutes to be scrapped. But something like that, I was very sensitive to. And I think that we don't need that, the optics of that, and also the integrity of the peacock chair. Even though it's not directly linked to the Black Panther Party, but the only time you see it in the exhibit is when Huey's sitting in it. So even if it's not direct, I go thrifting and I always see vinyls with peacock. Every 70s vinyl had a peacock chair where they're like leaning up on it. So it's not directly linked, but I didn't like the optics. And also here I was very lucky to work closely with the shop, and I explicitly said I don't want to see Angela Davis's face on a t-shirt. I don't want to see Huey's face on a t-shirt because I don't like the fact that anyone can purchase that, and now they just get to walk around and have revolutionaries' faces on them, and who knows what type of feeling that might evoke from Black folks. And I know I don't like that feeling of seeing someone just wearing that. It's not we don't own their faces, so why put that? So that's a really good question, and I hope that both of us answered, yeah.
One more thing I will say about the peacock chair. So the peacock chair has been co-opted to sell clothes. There's an ad featuring Naomi Campbell. She has a fake fur collar on, looks like it's a fake suede jacket, and she has a raised fist, and it's not even the right hand in combination. And there's also a series of ads that also were co-opted and appropriated around Angela Davis and the capture of Angela Davis, again, to sell clothes. You can look at the same thing with Benetton. And those series of ads, then you look at them and you go, what does this have to do with selling t-shirts or tops or dress? The visual imagery that's used. Yeah.
We have time for like one more question, anyone? One more question? No? Is that a hand or is that a, okay. Okay. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for coming to Poster House. They traveled far, everyone. They traveled very far. Thank you all so much for coming to Poster House. If you're able to come back and see Black Power, if you've already seen it, come see it again. If you haven't seen it yet, please come back. We're free every Friday. And on First Fridays, we have some fun things to do in addition to being free, in addition to being open late, in addition to our bar being open. So come back, and thank you all for taking time today to come to this event.